Okay, well today we're going to be talking, kind of continuing our talk about the dynamics of culture. In our last session we talked about the outward manifestations of culture, which was of course our behavior and customs, material products, language, religious symbols, and cultural emblems. So those are all the things we said that you're going to notice right away. Even a short-term mission trip, you go there, these are all the things that are going to be hitting your senses, and you're going, oh yes, this is different here. We're in a different place. Well, now we're going to go a little bit deeper into the culture, and this session will look at the inward dimensions of culture. And we'll look at it in three different ways. We'll look at culture answers these questions: what is valuable, what is real, and what is true. Okay? And so each culture promotes values, and we've all heard that phrase, American values. And so, and maybe let me reiterate this before we get going. Not everybody buys into this. You always have in every culture kind of a countercultural movement that says, you know, our values are different than the mainstream or whatever. But think of that culture as the mainstream. You know, it's that current that's trying to push everybody. And if people do resist, there is going to be friction. There's going to be social sanctions against that person. And so any resistance will be pushed on. But there are individuals within any culture that will stand up against it. And as we all know, sometimes the gospel calls us to stand up against things in the culture that at least to balance it, if not to come out exactly against it. But let's think about that. What is valuable? Let's think about, first of all, I think we start with our culture and then look out and try to possibly think of what other cultures would promote as their values that will help us. And I just jotted down some ideas here. What would be American values? I came up with being competitive. And we'll have slogans probably for each value you have, like you snooze, you lose. All right, would be one of those. How about freedom of speech? Tolerance. That's a big one in our culture today. Being honest and frank, forthright. Progress is a value. Anything that moves us ahead along the way, gets us ahead, is a good value that we have. Hard work would be American value. Getting ahead. All right, so all of those type of things are high on American values. Now to think of it then, when you think of other cultures, I tried to write some things down of just things that I've encountered in Asia, my travels in Africa and Latin America. And some of those other things that you would see there was more things like being cooperative, doing your duty, speaking with respect to your elders, family, interdependence, harmony. See, those are just a few of those. And you can see a lot of those actually stand in contrast to American culture. And that's one of the challenges that you as a missionary, when you go to that culture where God has sent you, to those people, you have different values sometimes than what the native culture do. What's somewhat interesting is sometimes if you're in a church planting situation, sometimes those people that appreciate American values that live in that culture will be the ones that are attracted to you, per se. And so sometimes not having those values is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But it's certainly you need to know and understand what the values of the culture are. Because if you want to call somebody in that culture to stand up against those values that the culture honors, they need to, you need to know what those are and what you're asking them to do. And that's another thing, when you're ministering cross-culturally, to understand, I may believe in freedom of speech, that you need to speak forth what you believe, but I shouldn't put that on someone else that lives in that culture. And just tell them, you just got to speak your mind. Forget what your grandfather's telling you. Forget what your mom and dad are telling you. In America, and how many times, and I put myself in that, has a missionary said, in my country, this is what we do. And no matter how much I study this stuff, I still fall into those traps. I mean, I remember just even a few years ago, I was inviting a doctor to go with me on a medical mission. Well, this doctor was from another country, and he said, well, let me see what my pastor says. And it just seemed so strange to me. And I says, you have to ask permission from your pastor? He said, well yeah, he's my pastor. and I was trying to encourage him, well, you don't have to ask your pastor. In America, when I ask a doctor if he wants to go on a medical mission, he doesn't ask anybody's permission. He will inform his pastor, oh, by the way, I'm going on a mission trip. And so it was just kind of an interesting thing. But that's culture, isn't it? Right? In America, a doctor makes his own decisions, right? It's his life, it's his practice. But in Mexico, that doctor said, well, I've got to check with my pastor, have him pray about it. And it was just it's all culture. And so you got to be careful when you're ministering there. You have to understand their values, why they feel that way, why it's important, and have patience then with that process. You know, if they have to ask permission, they don't have the freedom promoted in their culture like we are. So that's where those values, you have to understand them. You know, otherwise, you're going to be asking people to do things that are against their values, and it will be very difficult, very, very difficult for them. Another example, I remember some American missionaries having trouble with people not being as forthright and frank as Americans are. You know, instead of confronting someone about something, they would kind of, well, I know in Filipino culture, you never confront someone to their face. You always talk to a third party, and the third party comes and drops hints about it. You know, you never tell anybody, because they call that, you know, losing face. You know, to cause shame to someone is, you know, not very valuable to their culture. So you wouldn't do that. In that culture, you always kind of talk around the issues, and you will get the message across, by the way. You can communicate it. But rather than that front end where they lose face and shame and have to withdraw from the relationship, you go kind of work through the system, and it works well that way. So those are all things you'll learn as you get more integrated in your culture, but start looking for those now. The next area we wanted to talk about was what is real. Now, a lot of times this area is called the worldview. Anthropologists will say this is the worldview. You know, and basically all what they're saying is that this is what that particular culture, what they believe is to be real, and it's the basic assumptions about the reality that go along with that. Let me give you another missionary story that will point out some truths here about the culture's belief in reality. I was planting a church in the Philippines, and I noticed that one of our church members was doing restructures in their house. And so I made comment on it on Sunday morning. I said, well, Perla, I see you're doing some renovations and your house is looking good. And as soon as I said that, and Perla said thank you, another church member behind her says, Perla, tell the pastor. And then she got a little bit sheepish, and so I said, well, Perla, is there something you need to tell me, or what's happening? And so she told me the story of why they were doing their renovations. It seems that a few weeks earlier, they had been hearing somebody walking on the roof, or heard footsteps on the roof. And it really scared her and the children. And her husband was away at work and wasn't home that evening, and so they were getting all scared. And it's something that continued to happen night after night. And so they went out and tried to see what was up there and couldn't see anything. So Perla told her husband about it, and through a contact in work, he brought to their house a Chinese wizard. And the wizard came and looked at their house, inspected their house, went all through it, went out the back door, looked outside, and then brought the family together and says, okay, I found out what the problem is. He said, the dwarfs in your mango tree are angry. here's what I want you to do. He said, I want you, first of all, the symmetry of your house is all bad. Your front gate is too close to the driveway. You need to put it in the middle of your wall. And he went through every home there and said you need to move the doorway just over like 4 inches, and told them how to restructure their house to bring harmony, with the spirits, with the spirit world. And then he says, well, what I want you to do every morning, I want you to take off a mango leaf from your mango tree, put it on your counter, put a raw egg on top of it, and then gave her some incantations that she should be chanting. So if you do this, this will calm your problem. The dwarves will no longer be angry. And so here I was listening to that with another missionary, and of course I don't know what our expressions of our face must have been saying, but I was really realizing that I'm seeing into a whole new world here that I didn't even know existed. And all throughout the Philippines, you have this belief in the spirit world, that there's good and evil forces and actually entities, spirits. And they'll believe in aswangs, which are witches, and bats. And it's very deep study of really animistic belief. And but what I asked her this morning, I finally asked her, I said, well, Perla, let me ask you one thing. She says, yes, Pastor, what? I said, did it work? Well, she says, well, no. The dwarfs are still angry. They're still walking on top of my roof. Says, okay, here's what I want you to do. Says, you don't need to do the mango leaves. You've already done the restructuring of your house. Don't worry about that. But instead of taking the mango leaves off and putting a raw egg on it, when you start hearing those noises, I want you to gather your family together. And I want you to pray. Pray in the name of Jesus that God will protect you. Thank him, and bless him for your protection, and come against that. And then, I believe you'll have peace. Well, the next Sunday morning, she came with a smile on her face, beaming, said, yes, Pastor, it worked. The dwarves are no longer angry. They're leaving us alone now. So I said, okay. That worked. Now, as a Westerner, I could have mocked her. I could have shamed her and told her there's no such thing as dwarves. Dwarves are not walking on your roof. My idea was there's probably cats up there that are walking, or some animal or something like that. But I didn't want to shame her on that, because I thought if I do that, no one's ever going to come to me for counsel again. So I need to reaffirm that, yeah, there exists. And I called the dwarves spirits. I says, the Bible talks about spirits that will torment us. So maybe this is a spiritual issue. So I treated it as a spiritual issue, and it resolved itself in a very positive way. And so when we talk about these, views of reality, I've actually even call it, these cultures, and anthropologists, by the way, tell us that 80% of the world's cultures today believe in this kind of animistic, we call it a magical worldview, that there are spirits that are behind all these activities, whereas we in the West have a mechanical worldview, where we believe everything is caused by science. Just think of the global warming, that whole issue. We are responsible for the earth. We are doing this ourselves. Just that whole idea is so foreign to so many different parts of the world. So in other parts of the world, when people get sick, they don't ask what's making me sick. They'll say, who's making me sick? Is it a spirit? Has someone put a curse on me? Is it retribution for some action I did and God is angry at me and punishing me? Those are how people of other cultures think in those terms. So that's your reality map. And like I said, ours is a very scientific, what we observe is what is real, where in many other parts of the world, it's, these spirits, they're alive. That's true reality. And then the final one we'll talk about in this session is what is true. Now this is a little bit hard for us from the West to really understand, because we do live in a multicultural society, and because our culture promotes and values freedom of speech and tolerance, a America really doesn't have a one voice right now. I mean, there just doesn't exist. But I want you to think of times past when, nations were divided according to religion, religious belief. This was a Hindu nation, this was a Christian nation, this was a Muslim nation. When everything was intact and everyone, kind of played by those same rules, truth was presented by each culture. Now, but like the cultures that you're going to be going to probably don't have quite as much freedom of press, freedom of speech, and so everyone will have more of a mentality of this is what is true, right? So I'll just say that. Like for example, if you go to Mexico, I mean, it would be hard pressed. Now there are atheists in Mexico, but it'd be hard pressed not to find a Mexican who doesn't believe in Jesus Christ, that he died on the cross and rose from the dead. Catholic, Protestant, it doesn't matter. I mean, everyone, it's almost universal in Latin America. This is true, right? They believe in that. Now again, as I mentioned, there are other faiths there in Mexico, and there are atheists. I've met a few, but it's really few and far between. You really don't have them. Culture has taught them this is what is true. If you go to Islamic culture, God cannot have a son. The idea of the Trinity is just obnoxious in Islamic culture. They do not believe that God could ever possibly have a son. Well, that's the bedrock of Christianity and Christian nations and Western civilization for centuries. So there's always going to be that tension. Now, where it comes into tension in sharing the gospel then is how to present the truth in a way that not only makes sense to them, but they could digest it. I suppose maybe that'd be a good way to say it. Because you're probably not going to be very effective to go to an Islamic nation, sit up on a corner, and just say, God does have a son, his name is Jesus, believe in the son. You're probably not going to get too far with too many people. However, they believe that Jesus was a prophet, one of the prophets, and they don't mind talking about Jesus at all. If you just start out with Scripture, just talking about, here's what the Bible says that Jesus did, and what he did, while he was here, you can at least get started. And part of that's just building the relationship, to build up that relationship before you kind of get to maybe some of the harder things. But speaking the truth is going to be where it's going to be the most difficult for you as far as being in a different culture, when you start talking about those things that you hold to be true. Because you can think about it, I could live next door to a Hindu, and a lot of our values, if we live in the same neighborhood, are probably going to be the same. We believe in hard work, we believe in education, we value, progress, we value technology. You could line up and say a lot of our values would be actually the same. But when you get to the truth claims of what we believe to be true, because they believe that God manifests himself in many, many ways. There's millions of gods, right? They believe that the spirit, Atman, is in every being animals as well as every living thing has a spirit, and it's the same spirit. so the whole thing. So we can't go along with those truth claims of Hindus. There's where the clash is going to come in, and of course that's where the sharing of the gospel really can be tricky, and that's why you've got to spend the time building relationships so that you can have an audience and share your belief and be heard without being rejected. And so that's why, in a sense, we're teaching all this stuff about being sensitive to culture, so that it basically gives you the time to be able to build a relationship, to be accepted. When you show them respect, honor them, so they'll be very reciprocal on your part. And then you can be that minister that God truly wants you to be in that culture where God has placed you.